Hey everybody, welcome back to Bible Fun with the Duns. Today we read Matthew chapter number 6. Now in Matthew, in chapters 5, 6, and 7, we have what we call the Sermon on the Mount. In this sermon, Jesus gives his people a crash course on discipleship. So this sermon is not about how to get into the kingdom as much as this sermon is about what do you do and what's in you and what's produced in your life when you're in the kingdom. So you'll notice that in chapter 6, Jesus is going to talk about probably the three most obvious pillars of first century Judaism. So Jesus is going to talk about giving, he's going to talk about praying, he's going to talk about fasting. You're going to notice that also at the end of this, he's going to talk about not just those pillars, but he's going to talk about mountains and valleys. For instance, he's going to talk about how we rejoice, but he's also going to talk about how we worry. So at the very beginning, there are these pillars: fasting, giving, and praying. Those are things that Jesus is going to come alongside all of the people that are listening. And Jesus is going to say that these things are best done. And he uses a word here. I don't know if he actually uses this word often, but he does a couple of times. But he's implying something shocking, that those things are things that are best done in secret. So he says that when you give, you ought to give when nobody's watching. When you do, you ought to do things when nobody's watching. When you pray, you ought to pray when nobody's watching. Now, what's interesting about that is that Jesus is not saying, he's not condemning public prayer. He's condemning the kind of prayer that's self-serving. He's not condemning giving. He's condemning the kind of giving where people know what you're giving for. And so what Jesus is doing in this whole moment, he says, if at any point, anything in your heart is motivated for how people see you or think about you, or that they might think you greater or better or more spiritual or God, if any of that's about you, he said, then we got a problem. Now you got to remember that through all of this, what Jesus is teaching us is what life is like in the kingdom. Now, a lot of this stuff doesn't sound normal to us, but it's normal to him. Well, why is it normal to him and abnormal to us? Because we're not from where he's from. But where he's from, all this stuff is normal. So now he's teaching us what life is supposed to be like in the kingdom. And in the kingdom, it can't be about us. So even then when his disciples ask him later in this chapter, they're going to ask him, how do we pray? He said, first of all, you got to start out with who you're praying to. He said, our Father who is in heaven. And he's not talking about a God we can see, and he's not talking about a God that we're equals with or a God that we can hold in our hands. He's talking about the God. And what he's talking about as he's praying all of this, as he's saying it all, what Jesus is doing in all of this praying is showing us that our God has a big ear open towards his people. But listen, we access him through faith and sincerity. So the Pharisees would stand and they would pray and they wanted everybody to see them. Jesus said, hey, why don't you go to a quiet spot and pray this stuff? He said, because if you're really seeking him, then you don't need an audience. I remember years ago, I heard a story. I think it was like Abraham Lincoln. There was a dinner at the White House, and they said, Mr. President, will you pray? And he bowed his head, and he starts to pray. I could be wrong about Lincoln, or it could be somebody else. That doesn't matter. So he starts to pray, and he's praying really quiet. Father, thank you. And one of the guests at the end of the table said, hey, speak up. We can't hear you. And the president looks up and he goes, it's fine. I wasn't talking to you anyway. And just goes back to his prayer. I just kind of like that. But I think that what's happening here is if we will read all of chapter 6 under the attention of, I got to be really careful about my motivations. If my motivation is at all tempted toward the spotlight or being some kind of celebrity, then now my heart is out of order with who my God is supposed to be. If I'm tempting to be better, then I'm trying to slip in that spot. And that's the opposite of what Jesus is saying in this. Jax, what'd you get out of this chapter?
Okay, so kind of a really big underlying theme in these first few parts where he's talking about praying, giving, and fasting. He says to do all of it in secret. And so just a really big part of that is humility, like we were just talking about a second ago. And so you don't want to do things for others because, No, I don't like the way I put that. You do want to do things for others, but when you're doing stuff like that, you shouldn't be doing it for yourself. The things that you do for others, you should not be for yourself and your own personal gain. It should be because you love God and you want to do what He says. And so that kind of goes with the giving part, and then and praying and all that. That's just like it's important that you do that in private because that's like your own personal time with God. And the way he's like referencing what the Pharisees did, what the Pharisees would do, they would go out in the streets, and where it talks about how they would babble, they would like pray these big long prayers and use like big words to kind of show how intelligent they are and how educated and like show they were better than other people almost. He's saying not to do that, and it's your personal time with God, and so you need to focus on Him. And so that focus also brings me to something else he said, and I can't remember the exact verse for it, but he says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so if you're so self-centered like that, and you want all the attention for yourself, then that's your treasure, and yourself is your treasure, and so your heart is gonna do things, and you're gonna do things to chase after yourself instead of God, and chasing after anything instead of God is going in the wrong direction. It's going backwards. So we just got to remember that through this humility and keeping God first, that's how we stay on the right track.
Okay, I like it. I want to end our time in this chapter by looking at what ends up being the last verse of the whole chapter. So look at Matthew 6, verse 34. And just notice this simple verse, right? Therefore, do not worry about what?
Tomorrow.
Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. So what I liked about that, there was a guy years ago named D.A. Carson. He wrote this. He said, our gracious God intends us not to worry about tomorrow. Instead, God intends us to take life one step at a time, no more. To be responsible for today, to not fret about tomorrow, and if there will be new troubles on tomorrow, we will face those things with fresh grace every day. So I like the idea that we are designed to be creatures of now. We can remember yesterday, we can worry about tomorrow, but we can only live in today. Worrying about tomorrow does not add help for tomorrow. Instead, worry about tomorrow only zaps tomorrow of its present joy. And so, what do? We take every day one step at a time. When I think about that verse, I think about the story of manna in the Old Testament. They had to wake up every single day. They had to go get it out in the ground. They had to bring it inside, and they eat every day their father fed them. They couldn't put it up. They couldn't store it. They couldn't keep more for the next day. They had to get up every day with fresh grace, walk outside, and get what the Father had given them. So what do? You don't worry about tomorrow. Instead, you live for Him and walk by faith in Him today. That's how I want us to end. We'll see you tomorrow in Matthew chapter 7. Bye.